The Green Berets, 1968. The story of Vietnam on screen begins with one of the most controversial projects of its era, The Green Berets. Released in the summer of 1968, co-directed by and starring John Wayne, it stands as the only major Hollywood production during the conflict that openly defended America's role in Southeast Asia. At a time when the nation was divided, Wayne's film tried to offer certainty. Instead, it revealed just how fractured the culture had become. John Wayne was more than a movie star by the late 1960s. He'd become a symbol of traditional American values, rugged individualism, and unshakable patriotism. When he decided to adapt Robin Moore's novel, The Green Berets, Wayne was already aware the film would face resistance. Protests were sweeping college campuses, newspapers were filled with grim headlines from the battlefield, and public opinion had begun to sour against the war. Yet Wayne pressed on, convinced it was Hollywood's duty to show why the war mattered. The film itself follows a group of U.S. Army Special Forces, the so-called Green Berets, on missions in South Vietnam. It combines action sequences, training camp camaraderie, and a dramatic finale set against a Viet Cong attack. To Wayne and his supporters, it was a patriotic adventure story. To critics, it was blatant propaganda. The U.S. Department of Defense offered its full cooperation. Military advisors helped with the script, real Army bases were used for filming, and the Pentagon even provided helicopters and equipment. Wayne knew he was making a statement not just with the story, but with the authenticity of the production. The film's premiere in Atlanta, Georgia, became a major event, attended by political figures and warmly embraced by audiences who still supported the war effort. But in New York and Los Angeles, the reaction was starkly different. Critics like Roger Ebert lambasted the film, calling it offensive for its simplification of the conflict and its portrayal of the Vietnamese enemy. The New York Times dismissed it as heavy-handed. For many in the press, the problem was not that Wayne was patriotic, but that the movie ignored the moral and political complexity of the war itself. Yet, despite the reviews, The Green Berets made money. Audiences outside the major cities were eager to see John Wayne play the kind of heroic role he had perfected in Westerns and World War II films. For families with loved ones serving overseas, the film offered comfort, a vision of victory, clarity, and purpose at a time when news broadcasts showed little of that. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. If The Green Berets reflected patriotic optimism, then, a decade later, Go Tell the Spartans revealed the weary disillusionment that had set in. Released in 1978, this small, unpretentious film starred the legendary Burt Lancaster, an actor whose screen presence carried both authority and gravity. Unlike the heroic tone of John Wayne's Vietnam story, Go Tell the Spartans offered a stark, unglamorous vision of a war already destined for failure. The film is set not in the late stages of Vietnam, but in the early 1960s before full-scale U.S. involvement. It follows a small American advisory group stationed in a remote village. Lancaster plays Major Asa Barker, a battle-worn officer whose age and experience make him skeptical of the entire mission. Around him are young recruits, eager but unprepared, who quickly find themselves caught in a hopeless situation. The title itself, Go Tell the Spartans, comes from an ancient epitaph about soldiers dying in vain, and it perfectly captures the film's tone. Unlike Hollywood blockbusters of the era, this production had a modest budget and limited release. Directed by Ted Post, it avoided sweeping battle scenes or polished spectacle. Instead, it presented Vietnam as a war of mud, fatigue, and futility. Soldiers walk into traps, orders make little sense, and victories are illusions. In one haunting moment, Major Barker observes, "We're supposed to win hearts and minds, but all we're doing is losing both." That line, delivered with Lancaster's weary gravitas, encapsulates the essence of the movie. The timing of its release is important. 1978 was the same year that The Deer Hunter and Coming Home captured Oscars and headlines. Those films dealt with Vietnam's emotional and cultural aftermath, earning acclaim for their daring subject matter. In contrast, Go Tell the Spartans was overshadowed. It lacked the scale, the star-studded ensemble, or the awards campaign. But what it did have was honesty, a stripped-down portrait of the war before it became the Central American nightmare. Critics who saw the film recognized its quiet power. The Los Angeles Times praised Lancaster's performance, calling it one of his most dignified late-career roles. Reviewers noted how the film dared to show that even in the early stages, American advisors sensed the futility of their mission. In many ways, it was prophetic. The seeds of disaster were visible long before escalation. For Burt Lancaster, the role of Major Barker added a new dimension to his career. Known for playing dynamic, larger-than-life figures in classics like From Here to Eternity and Elmer Gantry, here he embodied resignation. His performance reflected not a man charging into battle, but one who had already seen too many and knew this one was lost before it began. The production's minimalism also contributed to its impact. Shot quickly and without the gloss of studio polish, it felt more like an independent war drama than a Hollywood feature. That rawness became its strength. The jungle doesn't look exotic, it looks exhausting. The soldiers don't seem heroic, they seem trapped. And the war, far from being noble, feels like a slow-motion tragedy unfolding in real time. The Boys in Company C, 1978. By the late 1970s, American cinema was finally beginning to process Vietnam more directly, and one of the earliest attempts to portray it with brutal honesty was The Boys in Company C, released in 1978 and directed by Sidney J. Furie. The film followed a group of young Marine recruits from boot camp to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Unlike the patriotic gloss of earlier war pictures, this one confronted the disillusionment, absurdity, and futility of the conflict head-on. The story begins with a familiar trope, a handful of new recruits, each with different backgrounds and personalities, thrown together under the harsh discipline of military training. We meet the wisecracking jokers, the reluctant draftees, the hopeful patriots. By the time they graduate, bonds have formed, but illusions are already crumbling. Once deployed to Vietnam, their dreams of adventure collide with the grinding reality of guerrilla warfare. Sidney J. Furie, best known at the time for the Ipcris File, avoided heroic cliches. Instead, he filmed The Boys in Company C with a sharp eye for irony. Scenes veer from dark humor to devastating tragedy, capturing the surreal contradictions of war. Soldiers are ordered to play soccer matches with local villagers as part of a public relations stunt, while in the background, real battles rage with little sense of purpose. The men begin to wonder if their lives are being gambled away for photo opportunities and propaganda headlines rather than victory. Critics often note that this film foreshadowed Oliver Stone's Platoon nearly a decade later. While Platoon is remembered as the definitive soldier's eye view of Vietnam, The Boys in Company C had already touched on similar ground. The difference was timing. Released the same year as Go Tell the Spartans, and only months before the Deer Hunter-dominated award season, Furie's film was overshadowed. Its raw, cynical tone made it harder to market to mainstream audiences still hesitant to confront Vietnam so directly. But for those who did see it, the impact was undeniable. Reviewers praised the ensemble cast, particularly Stan Shaw as Tyrone Washington, a soldier whose sharp wit masks deep despair, and Andrew Stevens as Dave Bisbee, a young man forced to wrestle with moral compromises. Their performances brought humanity to the chaos, reminding viewers that behind every uniform was an individual, not just a statistic. One striking anecdote about the film's release is how it resonated overseas. In Europe and Asia, where audiences often viewed Vietnam through a more critical lens, The Boys in Company C found a stronger following. For American veterans, meanwhile, the movie struck a nerve. Many recognized themselves in the weary faces of the platoon, men caught between duty and futility. The movie does not glamorize combat. Its firefights are chaotic and terrifying, not staged for excitement but for confusion. Soldiers stumble, panic, and break down. The enemy is rarely visible, heightening the sense that the war itself is an unseen trap, grinding away at the spirit as much as the body. At its core, the film is about disillusionment. The boys enter the Marines with varying expectations, but by the end, almost all of them realize that victory is an illusion. As one character bitterly remarks, "We're not fighting to win. We're fighting so they can say, 'We fought.'" That single line sums up the futility that defines so much of America's Vietnam experience. Who'll Stop the Rain, 1978. By the late 1970s, the Vietnam War had ended, but its shadow stretched far beyond the jungles of Southeast Asia. Hollywood began to grapple not only with the war itself, but also with its corrosive after-effects on American life. Few films captured that lingering trauma as powerfully as Who'll Stop the Rain, released in 1978 and based on Robert Stone's acclaimed novel Dog Soldiers. The film begins not on the battlefield but in the weary aftermath, when soldiers return home only to find themselves haunted by the conflict. Nick Nolte stars as Ray Hicks, a Vietnam veteran who becomes entangled in a dangerous heroin smuggling scheme. Tuesday, Weld plays Marge Converse, the troubled wife of a journalist who becomes caught in the spiral of violence and addiction. Together, they navigate a grim underworld where the war's corruption has followed them home. Unlike earlier Vietnam War films, Who'll Stop the Rain did not dwell on combat sequences or jungle ambushes. Instead, it focused on the war's insidious impact on American society, the spread of drugs, the erosion of trust, the sense of moral dislocation. For many viewers in 1978, this was not an abstract theme, but a lived reality. News stories regularly chronicled heroin addiction among veterans, and public debates raged over how the war had poisoned America's soul. Nick Nolte's performance is one of the film's anchors. At this stage of his career, Nolte was emerging as a powerful screen presence, and his portrayal of Hicks balanced toughness with vulnerability. Critics praised him for embodying a man hardened by combat, yet searching desperately for purpose. Tuesday, Weld, already known for her emotionally layered roles, added depth as a woman pulled into chaos against her will. Together, their chemistry gave the film its human center. Director Corel Rice, part of the British new wave of filmmakers, approached the story with a gritty, almost documentary style. The cinematography is unpolished, the violence sudden and shocking, the mood relentlessly bleak. This was no stylized crime thriller. Instead, it was a neo-noir infused with the psychological scars of war. Even the soundtrack, anchored by Creedence Clearwater Revival's song Who'll Stop the Rain, underscored the sense of exhaustion and despair. At the time of its release, the film did not achieve major commercial success. It was overshadowed by the grandeur of The Deer Hunter and the political urgency of Coming Home, both of which dominated award ceremonies in the same year. But among critics and cinephiles, Who'll Stop the Rain earned a reputation as one of the most searing portrayals of Vietnam's aftermath. The Washington Post praised its unflinching honesty, while Roger Ebert admired its refusal to sugarcoat the corrosive effects of the war. One powerful element of the story is its refusal to offer easy redemption. Unlike John Wayne's The Green Berets or even Burt Lancaster's Weary Dignity in Go Tell the Spartans, here, the war does not end when the fighting stops. It continues in broken families, in addiction, in moral compromises. Hicks, Marge, and those around them are not simply home. They are prisoners of memories and traumas that will never fully release them. Welcome Home, Soldier Boys, 1972. When most people think of Vietnam War films, they picture dense jungles, firefights, or the chaos of combat. Yet for many veterans, the true struggle began not in the war zone, but once they set foot back on American soil. Few films captured that painful reality as starkly as Welcome Home, Soldier Boys, released in 1972. It was among the first features to portray the alienation and rage of returning Vietnam veterans, a subject that mainstream Hollywood was hesitant to confront at the time. The film follows 4 young veterans who return home to a small town in Texas after serving in Vietnam. Expecting a warm welcome, they instead find indifference, hostility, and a lack of understanding from the very community they fought to protect. Jobs are scarce, families are distant, and the camaraderie they once knew in the military has vanished. As frustration grows, their sense of isolation curdles into bitterness and ultimately explodes in violent, tragic ways. Directed by Richard Compton, the film was raw and unsettling. It lacked the polish of larger studio productions, but in many ways that worked in its favor. Shot with a gritty, almost documentary style, it felt closer to the real lives of veterans than the glossy war epics of the period. The story does not glorify violence, but it does show how unchecked trauma and neglect can transform ordinary young men into something unrecognizable. One of the most striking elements of Welcome Home, Soldier Boys is how early it arrived. 1972 was still during the Vietnam War. American troops were not fully withdrawn until 1973, and the fall of Saigon would not occur until 1975. To release a film portraying veterans as disillusioned, angry, and even destructive was daring and controversial. Many theaters refused to screen it widely, and mainstream critics were unsettled by its unflinching tone. Yet, beneath the controversy lies an essential truth. The film echoed the real experiences of many veterans who felt abandoned upon their return. Headlines in the early 70s often told of soldiers struggling with unemployment, addiction, or post-traumatic stress, though the term PTSD would not become widely recognized until later in the decade. For countless men, the war ended in Vietnam only to continue in their minds and in their communities, where they were often treated as outcasts rather than heroes. The performances helped anchor the film's emotional weight. Joe Don Baker, who would later become known for both tough guy roles and comedic turns, brought a simmering intensity to his character. His portrayal reflected a veteran's inner conflict, loyalty to his fellow soldiers clashing with anger at a society that had turned its back. The ensemble cast, though less famous, gave authentic and unpolished performances that added to the realism. Critics at the time were divided. Some dismissed the film as exploitation, pointing to its violent climax as excessive. Others, however, recognized it as one of the first attempts to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that veterans were not being celebrated but forgotten. With America deeply divided over the war, Welcome Home, Soldier Boys was not a film designed to comfort audiences. It was designed to confront them. Today, the movie remains an underrated and largely forgotten entry in Vietnam-era cinema.